Hi friends, Tony Pompa here, Dean and Rector of the Cathedral Church in the Nativity on the south side of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And this is session 3 in a 4-week discussion, conversation, presentation on Celtic hagiography, the Celtic Saints hagiography. This in partnership with the Celtic Cultural Alliance, that wonderful organization here in the Lehigh Valley, centered in Bethlehem, that wonderful organization that connects people of Celtic heritage and also connects all people with Celtic cultural events and opportunities. And I'm happy to be offering this 4-week exploration of Celtic Saint hagiography. Support the Celtic Cultural Alliance. We love them. This is a tough year for all nonprofits, as you know, and we sure miss the big festival that we all love and adore. So keep the faith and keep on moving and keep on supporting the Celtic Cultural Alliance. So good evening. This is our exploration of Celtic Saint hagiography. And by way of quick review, I will remind you that hagiography, hagi, the Greek, translates to holy, and of course, ography is written story. So these are holy stories of holy people. But we're gonna test that one today, actually, when we talk about Saint Winifred. But the spirit of hagiography, I'll remind you, in the Celtic tradition speaks to the saints who have been, and the cultic practices that have sprung up around saints in the Celtic world. And I'll remind you that when we speak geographically of those places where there have been Celtic cultural influences, we are speaking of Ireland, of Wales, of Scotland, of Cornwall, which is down in the southwest part of England, and Brittany, which would be modern day piece of France and even Spain. So that's kind of the traditional Celtic world that we speak about, and when we explore our saints in hagiography, we are exploring saints from those places. By way of review, we have spoken in our first session. We started in Ireland. Last session, I did a bit more around Celtic spirituality and the influences on it, Christian Celtic spirituality. And then we talked about St. David and his hagiography. I'm staying in Wales because, as I confessed, I have Welsh heritage, even though I'm Anthony Rocco Pompa, very Italiano. My maternal side of my family is of Welsh heritage. I've traveled to Wales many times and I've led groups there. And I'm staying a bit in Wales today, and I want also today to focus on a female saint. And so we'll do that later when we speak about Saint Winifred, or Gwenfrui, who is behind me here. Just to remind you a bit about hagiography. Hagiography is a story about saints. You will, if you do a quick Google search of, say, any saint, often Wikipedia will give you misinformation. They'll often talk about the written biography of saints. There are some of those. There's not a lot of those. Mostly what we have, particularly with the Welsh saints, are hagiography or hagiographical accounts. I'll remind you that hagiographical accounts were written many years after a particular saint may have lived, many hundreds of years in most cases after a saint may have lived, that some information in those hagiographies may be historical fact, but hagiographies were written, often to make the case of importance in a particular time, in a particular period, and within a particular agenda, usually to establish legitimacy around some sort of cultic practice or awareness, perhaps the founding of a monastery to bring it legitimacy, or as we experienced last week in the Hagiography of St. David, written by that particular hagiography piece was written to lift up and hang on to Welsh cultic practices in the midst of the Norman invasion, for example. So, legitimacy, tying it to an important piece of context. Two, it was also sometimes an economical thing, establishing the saint's place, leveraged as opposed to other saints, so that it would be a place that folk would revere and want to travel to, and where local authorities might want to invest. So that typically tends to be true. The third component of hagiographical material is they often have stories of the miraculous in them. And these are stories to offer perhaps Christian apologetics into a particular pagan understanding of things. And these stories often show the saints having power and supernatural power, or power over the natural world as well. And that is to set it apart, tying it often to Christ-like activities, so that it distinguished itself from the pagan world and tied it to a Christian world. So there is kind of the basic piece of hagiography. Today, tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about the spirit of the Welsh saints in general, give you a little bit of history, actually, and I'd like to use that as the platform then to talk a little bit about the hagiography of Saint Winifred, or Winfrey, as they say in Welsh, kind of. My Welsh is not great. So I want to talk a little bit about the Welsh experience of the Christian saint. So when we say saint in Christian world, in tradition, saint is used in the scriptures. St. Paul refers to a saint. A saint is anyone who is a baptized follower of Christ, of the Christ. A saint in the Celtic Christian world, or those who got elevated through hagiography, and who typically followed a pious discipline, and who, particularly the revered saints in Celtic Christian world, were folks who established monastic communities. The very earliest, the reaching of the Christian world into the Celtic, pre-Christian Celtic world was done by Peregrini. That's a Latin word. That is a pious explorer. That is one who is out to explore the world for the sake of finding the holiness within themselves. These folks, as you know, would dig out coracles in Ireland. They'd get in these boats and they'd head across the Irish Sea, and they cared not where they would land, but only to discover the Christ and the holy. And so But these great Celtic Peregrini made their way around the Celtic world that we know today. And in every place, they would establish, through their pious traditions, they would establish what we know of today as monastic communities. Last week, you will remember that one of the elements that's core to a Celtic spirituality is one that was actually inherited from the Druids, and that was a love of learning. The Druids were terrific about being in small communities who were designed to learn. This melded in Wales with the system of, in modern day, we would call it community design. The early rural tradition in Wales, where people assembled in what were called clans. That's L-L-A-N-S, and if you're interested in speaking Welsh, chlan is how you pronounce it, chlan. Wherever you see LL, clans, lans. So clans were small communities where people would gather and live. And if you travel in Wales, you will see a million signs introducing a chlan, which means a town, a gathering of community, a chlan. So Llandudno is one of those places, for example. And you know, in Welsh, there's many vowels and consonants, and so if you're driving out there and you don't have GPS, you will see lots of road signs pointing to different chlans with lots of definition behind them, and you have to get out of your car and read them carefully because they all look alike and sound alike if you want to get where you want to go. But in the early development of the monastic communities, it was a built-in, both a love of learning that came from the Druids and the organization of people in smaller communities in clans, led to a fertile ground for Celtic Christian saints to establish monastic communities. There are well over 700 saints in the Celtic world, well over 700. And in Wales, particularly, I'd like to mention just a couple quickly. And Dyfrig was one of the original Welsh saints. The three saints who actually would have been called the leaders of the Welsh Celtic Church would have been Dyfrig, that's D-Y-R-F-I-G, whose Latin name was Dubricius, Deniol, D-E-N-I-O-L, and of course David. Those three are considered, in the 5th and 6th century, they were considered the leaders of the Welsh Celtic Church, and each one of them established monastic communities. We talk about them together because they were leaders in an emerging age of a version of Christianity that existed at the end of the Roman Empire, the physical end of the Roman Empire, the end of the earth, as it were. They were also leaders in Wales in what was a difficult time in the 5th and 6th century, as the Yellow Plague is referenced by historians. And so they really navigated the church in a difficult time where there was lots of pestilence and death. And there was a great refugee migration because of the illness. In the cultic practice, in the early piece of that experience, there were many folk who would travel to Bardsey Island, what we know today as Bardsey Island, which is a little holy island off the coast of Wales. I've been to it. It's actually a natural reserve now. But there was a very lively and full monastic community. And in the early Celtic church in Wales, folk would go on pilgrimage to Bardsey Island, particularly during the Yellow Pestilence, because they would make their way on pilgrimage, many to die, they say, on Bardsey Island. So Bardsey Island is called the Island of 20,000 Saints because it is said that 20,000 early followers in that tradition, the Christian tradition, would make their way to Bardsey Island. I've been to Bardsey Island. It's not easy to get to Bardsey Island. The tidal waters around Bardsey Island are tricky and dangerous, and so to make a pilgrimage there was not an easy thing, particularly in the late 400s, early 500s AD, right? Okay, so Dubricius, or Dyfrig, was said to have established his peregrini along the Roman roads in Gwynedd. He was known as a bishop, and he would have been living and preaching and establishing small communities of monastic prayer in Llans, or along the Wye River Valley, which now hugs and is part of England. Actually, some of it is part of England. Denniol, D-E-N-I-O-L, was in kind of the northern part of Wales, and he founded two monasteries in North Wales. Bangor Fawr, F-A-W-R, is a Welsh word that means great, and another in Bangor. It is said that the monastery in Bangor, this is how they would say it, in Bangor was enormous. There's not much written, really, about Denniol, quite honestly, but there is a library now called the Gladstone Library that is attributed to his name. And it is a magnificent library, by the way, in case you end up going there. But it's said that in Bangor, where Denniol established the monastery of Fawr, great, F-A-W-R, there were over 2,000 monks in residence. That's a lot of monks. The third of the trinity of leaders of the Welsh Church, of course, was David, who we spoke about last week. I almost said last year, last week. So just a little bit of the Welsh experience of church and the experience of establishing the monastic traditions in Llans, both building upon the gift that the Druids gave, the love for learning in community, and the design of small communities in Llans, a natural ordering of things in Wales. Now, a transition to the hagiography of St. Winifred, remembering our hagiography teaching, that is that we're either establishing a monastic, we're establishing a legitimacy to a cultic practice, to we are elevating a saint among saints in the hope and potential that pilgrims would come and bring not just their own spiritual desires and needs, but also economy. And the third, remembering and realizing that the hagiography always has a story of miraculous things, the supernatural, or power over the natural order. Here's the thing about Winifred, or Gwynfrwy. Some scholars aren't sure that she actually existed. I'm not so sure about that, but some scholars have suggested that she may not have existed at all. However, it is said that she was a 7th century Welsh noblewoman, and her hagiography was written in the 12th century. And her hagiography was written in the 12th century, tying her to a holy place in what is today called Holy Well, where her well is indeed present. But in the 12th century, tying St. Winifred to a holy well where pilgrims were invited, encouraged to come for healing. I'm going to read to you a little bit about her hagiography, which is fascinating, and you can listen for our elements of hagiography. Winifred was said to have been a Welsh noblewoman who lived in the 7th century. Her protege was her uncle, Benno, B-E-U-N-O, who was indeed a priest and one in the spirit of Peregrini who had established a monastic community. It is said from her hagiography that Winifred dedicated her life to chastity in service to God. You will hear the virginal themes of St. Mary. In addition to being a holy woman, Winifred was reputed to have been beautiful. This is how the hagiography goes. She caught the eye of a pagan prince named Cultic, who made advances on her. Often you will hear in hagiography, particularly around women, you will hear the influences of worldly power, particularly around men, and virginal attributes among women, and the dynamic of power, worldly power, and spiritual power. Listen for that as well. She caught the eye of a pagan prince named Cultic, who of course made advances on her. She refused, fleeing from her house toward the church where Benno was leading mass. Cultic caught up with her and chopped off her head in a fit of rage. Benno, as soon as he found out, ran from the church to where her body lay. He cried out for God to judge Cultic. The earth opened up and swallowed Cultic, dragging Cultic straight to the bowels of hell. Benno placed Winifred's head on her neck and asked God to restore her life. He then went to the church and he finished his mass. When he returned, Winifred was miraculously revived, and just as though she had never died, but for a thin silver line around her neck where Cultic had struck her, a mark that she bore the rest of her life as an outward manifestation of God's grace. From the blood of her severed head, where it hit the ground, a spring burst forth out of the ground. And that fountain is purported to be the same one venerated to this very day as St. Winifred's Shrine, also known as Holywell. The waters of Holywell quickly developed a reputation for healing diseases and infirmities. And so the shrine became a pilgrimage destination in the 12th century and has continued to be so. Like many other popular late medieval and early modern saints, St. Winifred was first and foremost a healer. But whereas most saints were specialist healers whom people appealed to for healing for a specific ailment, St. Winifred was renowned as a healer of all manner of illnesses. Written reports of healings at her shrine in Holywell dated back to at least the 12th century. In his life of St. Winifred, Robert, the abbot of Shrewsbury, who was not her hagiographer, but who added to the hagiography written, attributed to St. Winifred the healing of leprosy, fevers, sores, and blindness. By the end of the Middle Ages, St. Winifred's reputation for healing had only grown. And in the 16th century, Welsh bard tutor Allen expanded the saint's repertoire when he wrote that she could heal blindness, lameness, skin disorders, mental deficiency, infertility, paralysis in arm or leg, deafness or dumbness, and she could even restore the dead to life. So in the hagiography, you hear the cultic establishment of practice of healing. You hear in that unfortunate story, the powers of spiritual goodness against the worldly powers of oppression and violence, and you hear of the miraculous healing of Winifred, and that healing power that burst forth from the very earth, a spring of life and healing, and throughout the ages, that hagiography took its own shape and continued to live on. I visited there, that shrine in Holywell, and there you can see two sections. There is kind of the original section where in history a small spring may indeed have been bursting forth from the grave. And in the 1600s, early 1700s, a shrine was built on top of it. And in the etchings of that pool, which you would not want to get in, by the way, on the etchings in the stonework around that pool, there are the names of folk who proclaim their healing from those waters, sketched into the very stone around St. Winifred's shrine. It's really moving, actually. Then there is a newer section of pool waters that actually you can indeed go in. And on the day that I visited, I did not go in those waters, but there were people there who were in the waters seeking healing and I think cooling off, actually. The other thing that is really quite impressive about the shrine is that it continues to be current and modern, and there is a piece of modern architecture where there is an actual gateway, a threshold, just distant from the pool. And on the top of that gateway, it says Mercy's Gate. I found that actually very moving, to step through the mercy toward the healing. So, my friends, there is St. Winifred, her hagiography, and a bit of visit in the Welsh land. Next week, our final week, I promise that I will talk about the hagiography of saints from other parts of Celtic world, maybe from Scotland, we'll see, or maybe from Brittany. We shall see. It has been my pleasure. I pray that you all are well, that you continue to be well, and in this time of pandemic, why not? Why not visit in our hearts a tradition of cultic practice? St. Winifred, for example, who offers healing. And wash your hands and keep your distance and wear a mask in crowded places. Blessings, my friends. We will see you next week. Take care.